Texas isn't supposed to shake like this. A magnitude 51 earthquake just rattled the heart of cattle country, and the weirdest part of this story isn't even the tremor itself. It's a hidden fracture in the crust that mirrors, almost exactly, one of the most destructive earthquake sequences in Ubaistarijau. As history, a sequence that happened hundreds of miles away. Stay with me, because by the time we're done, you'll know what's really underneath the Texas panhandle and why even the experts can't agree on what just took place there. Let's dive in. In the dark hours before dawn on Thursday, the ground jolted violently across a swath of ranch land in the Texas panhandle near the Oklahoma line. A 5.1 is genuinely rare for this part of the country. Say Texas and earthquake in the same breath, and most people's minds go straight to fracking. But let's be honest about the scale here. An earthquake this size would be unusual even if it were entirely human-caused. Typical fracking tremors sit below magnitude. One way too faint for anyone to feel? Induced quakes can grow larger when drilling happens to hit an existing fault directly. But what occurred here is something else, and it's already made national headlines. I spent hours digging into this, and here's what I found. This is a quake. Even the experts can't fully explain. The undisputed facts: it struck at 5:21 a.m., centered in rural Roberts County near the small town of Miami, Texas, close to Oklahoma. People felt it as far as Oklahoma City and Tulsa. A second weaker tremor hit later that day, hundreds of miles south. No injuries, no major damage. Here's where it gets odd. I combed through nearly every major news outlet covering this, and none of them agree on how rare this actually was. Some call it the strongest quake ever recorded in the Panhandle. Others say strongest in over a century. A few get more specific, claiming it's only the fourth quake of magnitude 4+ documented there since 1900. So which is it? And why can't anyone agree on the basics of something that happened mere hours ago? That contradiction, I think, is the most interesting part of this whole story. So stick around, because I'll walk you through 4 competing theories for what's happening underground in Texas right now. And the most honest answer might be the strangest one. Let's start with location. The epicenter sat in Roberts County, in quiet, flat ranch and farmland closer to Oklahoma than to any Texas city most people would recognize. The quake was shallow just a few miles down, which is exactly why the shaking traveled so far and hit so hard. This wasn't a local rumble. It reached Amarillo, Lubbock, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa reports came in from southwestern Kansas and the northern edge of Dallas-Fort Worth. Some residents said they felt it from nearly 250 miles away. People near the epicenter described being jolted awake by a sound like rolling thunder, except this thunder came from below, not above, for a region used to real thunderstorms, tornadoes, and hail. That says something about how unsettling this felt. By breakfast, hundreds of felt it reports had poured into the U.S. Geological Survey. Within hours, seismologists in 3 different states were suddenly fixated on a corner of the country most in their field rarely think twice about. And here's something most people don't realize: the Panhandle has quietly been shaking for over a century. Seismic records, they go back to 1907. Since then, researchers have logged roughly 20 earthquakes in that stretch of land. 3 previous ones crossed magnitude 5 in 1925, 1936, and 1948, with more following in 1951, 1974, and 1980. So what's actually sitting beneath all that quiet wheat and cattle country? This is where things get genuinely ancient. There's a buried fault system under this whole region, and it's not some new crack geologists trace it to the Amarillo-Wichita uplift, the buried remnant of an ancient rift where the continent once tried to tear itself apart and never finished. This failed rift dates to the early Cambrian period, roughly 500 million years ago, long before dinosaurs, long before anything with a backbone crawled onto land. Is this ancient scar responsible for Thursday's quake don't jump to conclusions? There are 4 theories on the table, and they might surprise you. This buried scar isn't just sitting there doing nothing. It rests quietly under the wheat fields, mostly dormant for enormous stretches of geologic time, until modern stress somehow reaches it. Or at least that's one theory. But the numbers don't perfectly add up, and that's worth unpacking. Back to that disagreement over whether this was the strongest quake ever recorded or just the strongest in a century, the explanation is stranger than the discrepancy itself. An earlier Panhandle quake, estimated at magnitude 5.4 in the 1930s, was never actually measured by a seismograph because there wasn't one anywhere near that remote area at the time. Instead, scientists back then estimated its size after the fact by mapping where people felt shaking and where damage turned up, essentially reconstructing an earthquake from old letters. newspaper clippings, and reports of cracked plaster. That estimate might be close to accurate, but it's built from human accounts, not instruments, making it hard to compare directly to Thursday's quake, which modern seismic equipment captured in real time. So when outlets call this the strongest ever recorded, they likely mean strongest ever measured by an instrument, not necessarily the strongest to ever physically occur there. Once you separate those two ideas, the confusion mostly clears up. Reporters aren't wrong. It's more like comparing an old hand-drawn sketch to a modern photo and arguing over which is more accurate. And that points to something a little uncomfortable. Texas' full seismic history is far blurrier than this week's dramatic headlines suggest, which brings us to the 4 competing explanations for what caused the ground to move. Thursday morning, scientists haven't ruled out any of them yet. Explanation 1, the one we've been building toward this ancient failed rift, simply reactivated on its own. This is currently the leading natural explanation. Tectonic stress builds slowly across a continent over long stretches of time, and eventually finds the weakest point in the crust to release through in the panhandle that's this same old rift system. No human activity required. Just geology doing what it's always done on a timescale that makes a human lifetime look like a blink. Explanation 2 is one almost nobody's talking about, even though it's fascinating old oil fields. Several historical panhandle quakes in 1936, 1966, 1974, 1980 happened directly above petroleum fields that were actively being drilled at the time. Researchers who studied those events suggested historical oil production might have triggered them, but those same researchers admitted a real limitation. The equipment of that era couldn't pinpoint depth or location with much precision. So this remains an open question, not a settled one. Explanation 3 is the one most people jump to. Immediately, modern wastewater injection tied to oil and gas drilling, commonly linked to fracking in the public mind. This is real and well documented in Oklahoma and parts of West Texas. Researchers have clearly shown that pumping leftover drilling fluid underground can trigger quakes along nearby faults. But officials responding to this specific panhandle event have been notably cautious, saying more data is needed before drawing a firm connection. A51 is unusually large for a fluid injection-triggered quake, and unlike the well-studied cases in the Permian Basin further west, this event doesn't yet have that same level of supporting evidence. Explanation 4, and you might laugh, is that nobody fully knows yet. In my opinion, that might be the most honest of the 4. Within hours, scientists were already saying publicly that determining the true cause takes time, careful data collection and detailed modeling, and that accumulated stress can absolutely reactivate an ancient fault entirely on its own without any help from the surface. In science, we don't know yet isn't a cop-out in this case. It's probably the single most accurate sentence in the whole story. But here's the detail that actually stopped me while researching this. Geologists studying the Amarillo, Wichita Uplift, have noted it shares a strikingly similar structure with the Reelfoot Rift, another ancient buried failed rift system in a completely different part of the country. The rift sits directly beneath the New Madrid region, where Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee meet the zone behind the legendary New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812, a sequence so powerful that some accounts describe the Mississippi River appearing to run backward. To be clear, no scientist is suggesting Texas is due for a repeat of anything on that scale. Nobody's predicting a New Madrid-level disaster in the Panhandle. What geologists are pointing out is narrower and more interesting than a doomsday prediction. Both regions share the same fundamental geology, an old failed rift buried deep, silent for hundreds of millions of years following the same basic blueprint. One just happens to sit under Texas wheat fields instead of the Mississippi River Valley. So what happens next? The USGS ran its forecast within hours, putting the odds of another quake of similar size or larger in the coming days at roughly 2, small but not 0. Their damage modeling showed low overall risk, mostly because so few people live in that stretch of the Panhandle, meaning serious injury or major economic loss is considered unlikely. But here's why this quake's size matters. Statistically, the Panhandle has now seen roughly 4 quakes of this magnitude, or larger, in about a century, working out to something like once every 25 to 30 years. Push the threshold to around magnitude. 5, 55, 6, and the odds shift dramatically that size shows up roughly once every 50 to 100 years. Push it to magnitude 6, and you're looking at something closer to a once in 3 centuries event. So this 5-1 isn't some bizarre fluke. It looks more like a clock finally striking an hour. It was always going to strike. Nobody knew exactly when. Because that's simply how earthquakes work, there's no way to predict them with real precision. A quick note on that second, smaller quake mentioned earlier, the one that hit hundreds of miles south later. The same day, that one roughly magnitude 3.9 struck a different part of central Texas, entirely geologically unrelated to the ancient rift beneath the Panhandle. Worth mentioning because it briefly confused people online who assumed the two were connected, maybe even aftershocks of each other. They weren't. Texas is a big state with multiple separate zones of seismic activity, some ancient and natural others tied more directly to modern industry, and two unrelated quakes. On the same day, in different regions, is more a coincidence of timing than anything connected. It's also worth explaining how scientists actually determine whether a quake was human-triggered, since that question keeps coming up. Researchers look at several factors together. The precise depth injection triggered quakes tend to cluster near the depth of nearby wastewater wells. The location relative to active injection sites. The timing did seismic activity increase after nearby injection ramped up, and how the ruptured fault compares to broader regional stress patterns already mapped by geologists. When enough of these line up, scientists can build a confident case linking a quake to industrial activity. When they don't line up cleanly, as appears to be the case here, the honest scientific move is to withhold judgment and keep gathering data rather than jump to conclusions. There's a peer-reviewed 2022 study in a respected geology journal examining Panhandle earthquake activity from 1983 to 2018. It found a sustained rise in smaller quakes magnitude 2.5+ over that period, and concluded most of those smaller events showed signs consistent with being linked to wastewater injection from the oil industry. Useful context, but it's worth noting what it doesn't tell us. That study focused on a large number of smaller routine quakes, accumulated gradually over decades, not an isolated event anywhere near magnitude 5. That's exactly why officials responding to this week's quake have hesitated to simply extend that same explanation to this event without further investigation. A bit more on the New Madrid comparison, since it deserves context. The New Madrid sequence of 18.111.2 is still widely considered among the most powerful earthquake sequences ever recorded in U.S. history. Multiple massive quakes struck within just a few months, strong enough to be felt as far as the eastern seaboard ring church bells hundreds of miles away, and permanently reshape the local landscape. Because the region was so sparsely populated at the time, compared to today, the human toll was relatively limited, given the scale. If a sequence like that struck today, given how much has been built up since the early 1800s, the consequences would be dramatically more severe. What makes the structural comparison genuinely interesting to geologists isn't that anyone expects a repeat performance. It's that both areas are what geologists call failed rifts places, where hundreds of millions of years ago, the continent began splitting apart and stopped partway through for reasons scientists still don't fully understand. Instead of forming a new ocean basin, the crust healed back over, leaving a long buried scar weaker and more fracture-prone than the surrounding rock, waiting through geologic time for the right combination of stress to reawaken it even briefly on a far smaller scale than 1811. Understanding that shared heritage doesn't tell us exactly when the Panhandle's next moderate quake will hit, but it does explain why this region, quiet as it seems, and quite as stable and predictable as most residents have assumed. So where does that leave us? The ground shook harder in the Texas Panhandle than any seismograph has ever directly recorded there. That part is settled. 4 explanations remain on the table, and scientists haven't landed on just one. And underneath it all sits a half-billion-year-old scar in the Earth's crust, one that shares its basic structural blueprint with one of the most violent earthquake sequences in American history. What happened in Texas this week wasn't impossible. If anything, it had essentially been quietly building toward this long before Texas existed in any recognizable form. That scar was already there waiting. If you found this as fascinating as I did, subscribe. We cover exactly these kinds of strange, underreported natural events every week, explained clearly and honestly without the hype. Let me know in the comments if you'd heard of the Real Foot Rift or the New Madrid earthquakes before this video. I'm genuinely curious how many of you already knew that piece of American geological history. I'll keep watching for developments out of the Panhandle and update you the moment there's anything meaningful to report. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.